And welcome back to the Fun Time program. I am your host, John Andrew Fredrickson, here with my beautiful co-host, Vivica Volt.
Hello.
You're actually looking beautiful today, and I'm looking a bit of a mess, but hopefully we can make this work anyway. We have an awesome guest on the Zoom today, Christina Roman. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago, studying biochemistry and molecular physics, studying specifically RNA structure using X-ray crystallography and protein engineering. That is a mouthful. That is a bit a lot to understand. So we're really excited to unpack that today. But we are also really excited to talk to you today, Christina, about your work as a student leader in racial and gender equity on campus and inclusion. So Christina Roman, welcome to the Fun Time program. Thank you for coming on today. How are you today?
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Don't forget the diversity, John.
Did I forget diversity?
It was diversity.
I've been sitting here practicing that intro. You've just got too much going on. I need my second cup of coffee.
There are a lot of words. There are a lot of words in that intro.
So basically, you are like Daenerys Targaryen, first of her name, mother of dragons.
Welcome to the show, Christina.
Too many titles. Yeah, thank you for having me.
How are you feeling today on this exciting today? Today is the Tuesday, the 5th of January, and we're in the middle of an election.
Oh my God, a very special election. We're going to find out later today if Mitch McConnell is out of work.
How are you feeling about that over in Chicago? Are people excited about it over there?
I think there's just a general stress. Like, when there's a problem that you can't do anything about and you're just kind of sitting there like... I think that's the vibe.
Yeah.
I feel that.
Yeah, we know the feeling. That's why we're like, well, let's just shoot a podcast today, take our mind off of the stress of the election. And hopefully by the time we're done shooting this, we can check back in. No, I guess it'll still be way too early to see how things are looking.
After we finish doing this, little workout, little video games, maybe a little editing, some dinner, and then we'll know the results.
My favorite headline today, I don't know if you guys saw this one, but apparently Trump was looking at going to his resort in Scotland for inauguration to kind of get away from the sadness of having to watch himself be removed from the presidency, and the president of Scotland told him, it's coming to golf is not a allowable entry into the country right now, and since he's not the president, he can't just roll in anymore. So they're basically denying him. I thought that was the coolest headline.
Oh, that's so sexy. Honestly, I love that other world leaders are just like, oh, you mean we don't have to tolerate you anymore? Get the fuck off our lawn.
I love that. Christina, tell us more about your work as a biochemistry and molecular biophysics PhD candidate. What those are all, I know those words. They're words that I know what they mean. But yeah, what does all that mean together?
Yeah, so that's the name of the PhD program. The department is Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. Mm-hmm. Basically, we just do biochemistry. Mm-hmm. Okay. And what that is understanding how biomolecules operate and do the things they do using the laws of the physical sciences to guide our explorations.
What are biomolecules?
In particular, okay, so biomolecules are like DNA, RNA, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates. These are what we call macromolecules because they're polymers of small biological molecules. And they do all sorts of different things and basically make up the entirety of living things.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's so cool.
Wow, that is awesome. Okay, and you're studying specifically RNA structure using X-ray crystallography and protein engineering. X-ray crystallography. These are some big words for me today. What is X-ray crystallography?
Yeah, so I feel like this is one of those science terms that does not make it into the public domain very often.
No, I've 100% never heard this before.
Yeah, so X-ray crystallography is basically taking a biomolecule that you want to understand the three-dimensional structure of, mm-hmm. And forcing it to concentrate down until it grows into a crystal, like rock candy. And then you shoot that crystal with X-rays. Mm-hmm. And because of the magic of physics, you will get a diffraction pattern of those X-rays, and you can use math to make that diffraction pattern back into an image. Usually light will bounce off of a thing, and then it will go into your eye, and your eye will focus that light into an image. Mm-hmm. We don't have any kind of lens for X-rays, and so we don't have the ability to directly just take a picture, see what 3D structure is.
Right.
We use math to do that. But essentially, it's just taking a picture of the three-dimensional structure with atomic level resolution. of any particular biomolecule you'd like.
Wow.
Usually people do this on proteins, but I do it on RNA.
You do it on RNA. Okay. And so what are you trying to discover by taking pictures of RNA?
First of all, I just want to interject and say, just the way you describe that just sounds so cool. It sounds so complicated that you're taking a picture, but then deconstructing that picture using math and rebuilding that picture using more math. That's fucking insane.
It's amazing how advanced our science is today, where it's like, we're used to the world that we can see with our eyes and we can touch with our hands, right? But there's this whole world of things that's happening on such a different scale that, it's very difficult for us to even comprehend what's going on there. But over the years, we've devised these techniques, incredible scientists like yourselves. I guess it would be people more in the engineering side of things, but you need the theory. You need to be able to understand, how that world is working to be able to devise tools that can be like, oh, we can turn it into a crystal. We can shoot it with X-rays. We can see what happens with those X-rays and then deconstruct it and use math to turn it into an actual picture that we can see with our eyes. It's like mind explode. You know what I mean? It's amazing to see that this kind of stuff is happening. So what are you trying to learn with this kind of imaging of RNA?
Yes. So our objective is just to understand RNA structure better, because we've been doing X-ray crystallography on proteins for a very long time, and we've solved many, many, many structures of proteins. And now we have a really good understanding of how proteins fold and how proteins operate and what shapes allow them to do, what shapes they can occupy that allow them to do biochemistry and catalyze reactions. RNA is way behind on that level of understanding. These days, most people use computational modeling to guess at what an RNA structure is. And it's not too common that people actually experimentally validate what the RNA structure is. Our lab does. And by seeing how the RNA folds and what shapes the RNA occupies, we can guess as to how the RNA does its biochemistry and kind of get a better understanding as to how biology uses RNA as a tool. So for example, viruses, which we've been talking about a whole lot, often use these structured RNAs to do things. And because we don't know what those RNAs look like, it's difficult to design drugs to interfere with those functions and interfere with the viruses. Mm-hmm. We also have RNAs in our bodies called long non-coding RNAs that do a lot of important regulation stuff. And that definitely involves the RNA being structured, but we don't really know what those structures look like and how we can interact with them and maybe mess with them. Wow. For medicinal purposes or otherwise. So yeah, it's just, our lab is trying to gather information so we can start building a better understanding of RNA structure as a whole.
Amazing.
That's so cool.
So is that considered kind of like basic science then, where it's like we just simply need to understand these things better?
Very basic
so
science.
That then people can take this information that you're putting out there and do all kinds of stuff with it once we have a better understanding of how these things are working.
Yep, exactly.
That's amazing.
So lots of people do research that's I want to answer this particular question. I want to know why this disease works this way. I want to figure out what this mechanism is. Our lab is just very zoomed out and we're just going to collect information and hopefully it'll be useful to someone.
Nice. So basically you're figuring out the basics of, okay, if we know how these particular things work, we can then see how that applies out to more specific things later because you know the basic structure of things.
That's amazing. Is that the kind of funding or the kind of research then that would be funded primarily by the National Institute of Health?
Yeah, so our lab is funded by the NIH. We've also been funded by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute before. Mm-hmm. We could be funded by the NSF, but the NSF tends to apply to more physical sciences than the biosciences. Mm-hmm. And our research also involves technology development, that protein engineering half, which might eventually have a medical application down the line.
Okay. Wow. So where do you see yourself going with this specific kind of study as you complete your PhD?
So in terms of where this research goes in the future, mm-hmm. Our lab does this thing called antibody engineering. So we try to make these little antibody fragments that will bind the RNAs that we're trying to crystallize. And then that allows us to crystallize the RNAs because RNA doesn't like to crystallize, but antibodies do. Oh. So as we engineer these antibodies to bind the RNA targets, we can crystallize more and more RNAs more and more quickly. Mm-hmm. It's possible that once we get better at making these antibody fragments, we can also put them into cells and use them to notice where RNAs are in the body or notice where the RNA is localizing in the cell or see when the RNA adopts a particular structure because RNAs can change their structures really easily. And that's part of what makes them so difficult to work with. But yeah, there's a lot of potential directions we could take this in. We could also zone in on a particular RNA target and try and really unpack a whole like large complex of RNAs. So for example, viruses often use these things called irises, internal ribosome entry sites. Getting the structure of an entire one would be a pretty big deal. But we tend to do these structural resolution projects looking at just little parts of it individually. So if we can get each of the individual little parts and build it into a larger picture, that would be pretty nice. We're also trying to apply this technology to cryo-electron microscopy, which is a whole nother structural technique that's like taking off right now.
Obviously, the pandemic has really brought viruses into people's forefront. You know, people are thinking about viruses now in a way that the regular public hadn't really thought of them before. You know, people would get sick, they would get the flu, whatever, but it wasn't like this huge global pandemic. And now that we've recognized kind of how susceptible humanity is to some random thing showing up in some random corner of the world and then spreading across the world and taking down the entire world economy. You know, the economy as a result of this, people are recognizing it's not just the life loss, but it's also, you know, the way it's affecting you know, people's livelihoods. How do you see your work changing our ability to respond to viruses or understand viruses better? Do you think that some of the work that you're doing with your lab to understand RNA better, to understand, you know, the way that it interacts with things, do you see your work enabling us to better deal with future viruses that come out of the blue?
It's possible. So one thing that our lab has been doing, as every other RNA lab has been doing, is studying COVID. And so if we can improve our efficiency as to how quickly we pick an RNA target and resolve the structure, which at this point we can get that down to about a month, where we find an RNA target, design some constructs, crystallize it, shoot it, solve the structure. The faster we can do that, the faster we can respond to RNA-based viral pandemics. Not all viruses are RNA-based, but a lot of them are. And that would allow us to get these 3D structures of these RNA elements and then speed up that drug development process.
Okay.
When COVID first hit, the people who do computational modeling of RNA structures did this with the COVID genome, but because it's modeling, we don't exactly know like if that's completely correct, if that's what it looks like in the cell, if it's like a contextual situation where it's one shape in one situation and another shape in another situation. Gotcha. It's hard to get an idea of how the like biochemical mechanism works when we do it that way. But with X-ray crystallography, we can at least get one solid, it definitely looks like this at least some of the time. And if we can lock it into this conformation, maybe we can start like messing with the virus.
Is that a necessary first step in producing vaccines, or is that just, it would be something that would be useful and would help speed up the process?
An approach. Yeah.
Got it.
Gotcha.
Okay.
There are lots of different ways to do this. Another way is like, if you were to try and screen for drugs that just like change the RNA's function, or just screen for drugs that change the virus's ability to replicate without knowing exactly what they're doing, that is also a very common and efficient way to start developing drugs that target viruses. Our approach is to say, let's say if we could just target this particular RNA and control it in a really specific way. Would that be useful? Could that be powerful? Interesting.
That's phenomenal. It's so exciting to hear that, you know, so many amazing people like yourself are working on these problems, so that as we discover new worldwide problems like this pandemic, we are discovering new ways that we can respond to it more quickly and more efficiently, hopefully in the future. Now, if we could just figure out a way to get a vaccine to go from discovery to approval in a much faster rate, we'd be in an even better shape. But that's a totally different problem, and I don't know how we're going to speed that one up.
Well, I mean, speeding up trials is really difficult.
Right. Because, you know, you can't just expose
you
people.
You want to let science move at science's pace.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's definitely not something you want to rush.
Fair enough. Yes. No, but it's still exciting to see that, you know, we're constantly developing better ways to understand these things.
And just understand the world around us in general. I mean, just understanding how RNA works. It's not just understanding viruses. It's understanding life as we know it, because RNA exists in so many different organisms.
Yeah. That's amazing.
RNA is currently, some people, caveat, believe to be the first, like, the start of life, where you just had a bubble of fat and some RNAs, and the RNAs were able to replicate themselves. And then from there, cells evolved.
Interesting.
Right? So RNA is in literally every living thing ever. And it's been used longer than proteins have. So we know that it has this massive potential to do biochemistry, but we tend to focus on proteins because that's the guys that are more common.
So RNA isn't just existing in living things. It's something that existed before life?
Yes.
Gotcha.
In fact, we know that RNA can assemble in a pool of chemicals given the right amount of energy. So RNA can naturally just appear from a chemical reaction. You get enough RNA nucleotides, they can polymerize. You get enough polymerized RNAs, you can get an RNA that does that polymerizes RNA itself, which is called an enzyme. And it can just do its whole own thing.
Interesting. So RNA can be present, on a planet, for example, without the presence of life. Is it something that we see commonly? Do we see it on other planets? Is that something if you go to Mars, are we seeing RNA just chilling out there?
I don't think we've looked for that yet.
Okay, fair enough.
We have looked for it on asteroids, and I seem to recall that we did find some precursors of RNA on asteroids, saying that it's not here yet, but it could be if there was enough energy to make these chemical reactions happen.
So if we know that there's a planet out there with a ton of water on it, I think we're probably going to expect to see stuff like RNA existing on that planet.
It depends what the chemical composition of. Also, this is astrobiology now, which I don't.
Right. No, I know. It's just that tends to be my favorite
John
area.
Just loves going to space with every straight to space with him.
Fair enough.
This whole theory is called the primordial soup theory.
Right.
So if you wanted to look it up on Wikipedia, that is the word that you would search.
Do you know if that's the one that they did a study in the 60s in the lab? They basically created primordial soup exactly and they electrocuted it, and they think that they were able to create. Were they actually able to create life doing that, or almost?
Well, they couldn't create life, but they could create a couple important biomolecules RNA, and DNA and that sort of stuff.
And that
is the precursor to life,
right? So that's why this theory is.
And there are other labs that try and establish the proof that if you just put molecules of RNA in little vesicles, that eventually you can get RNA that replicates in the vesicles that replicate just by themselves.
That is so cool.
That hasn't been proved yet, but people are working on it. They're pretty sure it's going to work.
Right.
That's so cool. That's so cool that at some point in our not too distant future, we might be able to watch evolution happening in a petri dish in real time. Put a time-lapse camera on that shit and be see, we told you.
Well, don't we already see...
we made life.
Right, at the beginning of life, for sure. Do we already see cells kind of evolving in a dish if you give them enough time? I don't know what the lifetime of cells are.
For sure.
You can witness evolution actually happening, mutation and...
Yeah, there are people who do these studies where they'll have a colony of bacteria in a fermenter where they're constantly adding new media and taking media out. And so they allow the bacteria to live for not just days, weeks, or months, but years and years and years. And they can continuously sequence the bacteria and see how that colony of bacteria is evolving.
Wow.
And then they can add selection pressures to see what kind of things can we make these bacteria evolve to do.
Right.
But yeah, evolution is something that we can definitely watch in a dish, at least with the power of bacteria, because they divide so quickly.
Right. That's amazing. That's amazing.
Oh, science is so fucking cool sometimes. Being able to break the way that our world works down into just the most basic elements and watching just bacteria move around in a dish and become a bigger structure of a bacterial colony is just so fucking cool.
What's amazing to me is that this is commonplace stuff for somebody like you who works in the fields and, gets to play with these things on a daily basis. And yet when you go out and you listen to people in the regular world have conversations about evolution can't be real because, monkeys can't turn into human beings. It just doesn't happen. It's if you're actually somebody who's exposed to what's happening with the science, it's almost well, duh, we can witness it in a dish. It doesn't take much to extrapolate how this could happen at a larger level. Plus, when you actually go and you look at the way they've dug up bones and that kind of stuff, and they can trace how this stuff happens over millions of years. But it's bizarre to me how people can go through their lives not exposed to this kind of science and just be totally mystified, and something like the Bible can make more sense to them as a world picture than the actual research being done by amazing people. So
that's just I was just going to say that's just explained by indoctrination.
Right.
I literally wasn't allowed to read science books that would have taught any of this. And when we had one earth science book that talked about how through evolution, there was different like rock formations, and you have like different layers of like rock from different eras. We literally had to skip over that. And we were told that actually this is all incorrect. And the real truth is that God created the earth in 6 days. And on the seventh day, he rested and he put everything in its place exactly how it should be. And the earth is only like 40,000 years old. And I was like, okay, cool. Because I literally was not given any other options as to what I was supposed to know. So I see how that happens. It's just really
for sure. I see how it happens. It's just a reminder that we need to tell these stories. Mm-hmm. You know, we need to. I
think it's a matter of culture too, right? Like our nation in particular is very like in love with religion and a little less in love with science. There are other countries where that's not the case at all, where like science is just facts, and that this is just how the world works,
provable.
And science isn't like neat and simple and easy to understand or logical, like a simple like Bible story might be, right?
Sure.
Like science is confusing and has like, well, in this case, this happens, but if you change this thing, then this happens, and it's like difficult to understand, and it can be frustrating and feel opaque. And also scientists aren't really interested in making science more understandable for the public.
Yes.
So
this is a huge challenge.
That's a whole other thing.
That's definitely something we're trying to like bridge that gap on, where we try to make science actually approachable for your average person. Because we love talking about science so much, but obviously we aren't doing the research like someone like you would be doing. So we love having someone like you come on and break down this barrier so that your research can be more approachable to the average person.
Exactly. And we're still kind of at the early stages of this podcast, but the way we see this is like, you know, we're so excited to bring you on and talk about the work that you're doing now, but we're also very excited about the work you're going to be doing in the future. So the hope for us is that as you're doing new things that you're excited to talk about, shoot us an email, hop on the Zoom, and we'll talk about it on here and we'll share it with our audience. So keep that open.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, keep that line open.
Speaking of things you're working on, let's talk about your work in diversity, inclusion, and equity on campus.
You just had to get that acronym in there, didn't you?
Well, because it's really entertaining that like if you mix the words up a little bit, you get the DIE acronym, but like you're trying to say it not in that order.
Yeah, I have to constantly be like, equity comes first. Equity comes first. But yeah, I do a lot of DEI work at UChicago. I have done this sort of stuff as long as I've been here. As it turns out, I'm actually a Black woman. I'm mixed race. But I identify as Black. What? I know. And
shocking. I'm absolutely stunned. How dare you drop this bomb on me in the midst of this?
I'm sorry. I should have given warning. But yeah, as a Black woman in science, it became pretty clear to me when I was an undergrad that like I play by a different set of rules than my white male counterparts. And I, being a passionate person, that really bothered me, and I had to do something about it. I was either going to not do science, or I was going to go do science in the most like aggressive, you have to listen to me because I'm here now kind of type way.
I already love this. Yes.
And so I came to UChicago and I was like, all right, so this is a very white school. We have this diverse cohort that came in with my year. There are a bunch of people of color that came in with my year and then didn't come in the year following. And I was trying to figure out, why was our year particularly diverse and the years preceding and the years after not diverse? What happened that went right the first time and what went wrong every other time?
Right.
And so me and my friends, who are also people of color, started like talking about this and unpacking it. And eventually we decided like, hey, we have a bunch of solutions to these problems because we've had these lived experiences as people of color. If we could just get the faculty to listen to our lived experiences, they can start changing how they like talk to people of color, how they recruit students of color, how they train students of color, and maybe make it a less like structurally racist environment.
So less hostile.
Yeah. Like, can we just like tone down the microaggressions? just a bit, and maybe more people will come in and stay on. And so that idea became this organization that I created with two other people. The organization is called GRIT, the Graduate Recruitment Initiative Team. The co-founders of this organization with me were Matt Perez and Cody Hernandez. And this Graduate Recruitment Initiative Team was able to change how we recruited graduate students in every individual department, and also started creating a model for other universities to follow for how they could improve their racial equity at their universities. From there, I did a whole bunch of other stuff. And now I currently serve as the Race and Pedagogy Working Group Graduate Coordinator at UChicago, where I advise like university-wide people, so students, administrators, faculty, as to how they can make more racially inclusive teaching methods, teaching approaches, programming, that sort of stuff.
Wow. So it sounds like in your day-to-day school life, not only are you doing all this research on basic yet oddly complicated science things, but you're also having a whole second job of fixing the campus to be more inclusive. And
but not just the campus. You're now talking to other universities
other
as well.
schools, and like creating. Right. But like I'm saying that you're basically double majoring in this situation, because you're having like to focus so much of your time on two very specific and completely different things.
Yeah, that's a problem that like a lot of people of color in academia, not just science, get into.
Yep.
Because a lot of us feel the way that I felt when I went into grad school, like I'm angry, I need to do something, we need to fix this problem.
Yep.
And then they kind of get like sucked into like having this double job responsibility where like when you look at the research, people are like, well, you haven't really done that much research. And then you look at the extracurriculars and you're like, oh my God, that's why you haven't done that much research. Yeah. So that like you have two jobs while everyone else has one phenomenon is definitely part of the problem.
Absolutely. And I think that that's kind of indicative of the Black experience in most aspects, because as a person of color walking into a space, 9 times out of 10, that space was not made for you. And having to mold that space to be less hostile to you upon walking in is either a mantle that some people are willing to take up, or it's one of those, I either have to stomach this or leave.
Right.
And sometimes it's
just too
fixing.
very bad choices.
Sometimes it's too daunting.
Well, this is why it's so important to tell these stories, because we're at a stage in this country where a lot of people in the country feel like racism isn't a problem anymore. It's something we fixed in the 60s. You know, we have the Civil Rights Act and everything's good to go. And there's a lot of almost pushback where people in parts of the country feel like, why are you still bothering us with this issue? I'm not racist. Nobody I know is racist. Racism doesn't exist anymore. So why are people still complaining? You know what I mean? And it's because as you enable more people to go into all walks of life, like academia, that's just the beginning. Mm-hmm. Now you have to figure out, how do you make these areas more inclusive and more welcoming and you know, not something where people have to constantly be fighting back against stuff that people who don't have that lived experience have no way to know that that's even going on. And so it's so important to tell these stories about people like yourself who are saying, you know what, here's a problem, but here's something I can do about it. And now let's look at what the cost is to somebody like yourself, because you have to spend all this time working on something like this to change the system, so that the hope is down the road, you know, people coming in behind you have less of a problem dealing with this and can just focus on their studies, like their white male counterparts who never have to think about this whatsoever. So do you see that this is changing as a result of your work?
Yeah. So I wouldn't say it was as a result of my work, because there are like scores of people like me doing this work everywhere. And like at every level of the university too. While a lot of these initiatives are student led, they're also like faculty administrators who've been fighting this fight for much longer than I've been in academia. Right.
They're just really encouraged that there are people coming in as from the student level who are like, yes, you can take this mantle up with us.
Yeah. And it's also like racial equity, like programming has kind of like really taken off, I feel, over the past couple years. As you've seen, like in the national conversation around race, everyone's kind of like putting their foot down now and saying like, all right, we need to do something. Right. This is ridiculous. It's been forever and we haven't like seen any of these changes.
Right.
So academia is kind of like a microcosm of what's happening at like the national level, where like students are like, I'm done, we need to address this. And administrators are like, you know what, we hear you. Let me just try. And students are like, you're not going fast enough.
Right.
And so there's this like back and forth of like, we'll make a thing that feels like really big change to like administrators, faculty, white people who don't see the problems that we see. And to us, we're like, that was minuscule.
Right.
You need to do so much more.
Right.
So it depends who you ask. If you're wanting to know, like, has there been change from like student leaders doing these sorts of like initiatives? Like, there has definitely been change. Things have been improving. The departments have rewritten their like diversity statements. They've changed the criteria for graduate admissions. They've done all these things, but we're nowhere close to done.
Right.
So yes and no.
Right.
So in a perfect world, with all the work that you're doing, I mean, I'm sure I probably know the answer to this question, but in a perfect world, after all of this work, what is your end goal? Like, what would the world look like to you after all of this work that you've put in? How would you want academia to look like that to you would feel diverse, equitable, and inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, I think an ideal diverse academic environment would look like you have people of color in all levels of the institution. So right now we have this like bubble of diverse graduate students, but very, very, very white faculty. And so there's this huge set of programs trying to get the students to make it all the way to the faculty level. And as we try and do that, we start seeing all these barriers that like, institutional racism has put in there to keep people from doing that.
Right.
But ideally you would have an equal level of diversity at all levels of academia. So from faculty all the way up to presidents and all the way down to like lab techs. And you would also have everyone feeling like they have the same standards to meet and they have the same work to do. So it wouldn't just be that Black students are doing the diversity inclusion work, white students would be doing the diversity inclusion work, white faculty would be doing the diversity inclusion work. Everyone would be contributing to like unpacking institutionalized racism because that's everyone's job.
Right.
And it's not like institutional racism will go away like in the next 10 years. It's institutional. It's built into the structure of the university. You have to like really dig deep and start unpacking these things. And another like observable trait of a like equitable and diverse institution would be everyone has like the same opportunities and you have like the same challenges to face. It's not that one student has to not only present their research, but also convince the professors they're speaking to that they're even worth listening to and that their opinions are valid.
Right.
But everyone has that same, I trust you. You have like the authority of a white man, regardless of what you look like.
Right.
Like, yeah. So that is what I think it would look like. It's just, it has to be diverse at every level. It has to be deeply diverse. Like it has to have not only people of color, but like people of all genders, people of all sexualities, people of like every level of diversity we can have, we need. And we'd also need to focus on the people who've been systemically excluded to make sure that diversity is evenly distributed. And everyone should just have the same challenges to face. It shouldn't be like much harder for one group of people because they look a certain way versus another.
Do you think that there is possibly like required coursework that undergraduates might be able to take? Like if they were to take like an anti-racist course in undergraduate, do you think that that might help address the systemic changes if everyone coming through the university was on the same baseline so that you're not having to constantly have the people of color unpack what is and isn't racist, how microaggressions work and what have you? Do you think that that might be useful for not just obviously your university, but universities across the board?
Yeah, I definitely. So I have two feelings about this.
Okay.
One, I think like required diversity training is a pretty good idea, or like offering classes that exclusively talk about like racial dynamics and the history of racism in America to undergrads is a great idea because that's a great way to introduce people to these ideas. What would be better though is if we taught racism and how race has interacted with every aspect of academia in every class. Because racism is an ocean I live in. Right. Why isn't it an ocean you live in?
Right.
Right. So if we're talking about history, we can talk about these historical events, but we can also talk about these historical events from the perspectives of people of color.
Right.
If we're talking about science, we can talk about how that research was done. And we can also talk about the research that was ignored because it was done by people of color.
Right.
Right. Like if we can make like talking about racism normal, talking about racism something anyone can do because we've all encountered it in everything we've studied.
Yeah.
it becomes a much easier problem to tackle because it's not this like strange thing that we don't understand and we don't know how to recognize. You can be taught how to recognize racism in every field of academia if we chose to. So
how would that look like for a professor who maybe has no lived experience with any of this and is being told, hey, this is something that we all need to get on board with. Every class should be thinking about this and thinking about including it in some way in their curriculum. How do you advise professors on going about actually doing that?
Yeah. So this is, I get hit with this question pretty often. And I think some people forget that people study race. So there are academics who do this justice like all the time.
Right.
So professors can actually use their colleagues, like their colleagues' research to educate themselves, right? They can actually read the papers like how they would if it were science, right?
But that's enabling them to understand the problem better. Are there guidelines or recommendations for how to implement that knowledge into changing their curriculum so that they're exposing their students to that kind of knowledge?
Yeah. So like I said, there are people who do this, right? So for example, the Race and Pedagogy Working Group exists to do exactly that, where we say, all right, we got all this research. We're going to boil it down for you, make it into a little memo. We can help you design the class that like you talk about like the race issues for like this quarter in. And they're also like organizations that do this sort of stuff. Like you'll be able to find these people in the DEI space everywhere. Like if you asked someone who does this work to do that, they could. The resources already exist. We can either like teach you individually, professor, how to do this, or we can teach a whole group of you, or we can like lead a workshop for a whole bunch of students. Like the information exists. It's just a matter of like giving us the authority to teach you what's going on right now. And I think a lot of professors are not comfortable with the idea of someone who's much younger than them, lower authority than them, telling them like, you don't know what racism is and I'm about to school you.
Right.
Like no one.
Right. Well, I mean, this is a problem of any new endeavor is that, right now you're going to have some of that pushback just because old people tend to think they know everything and aren't as open to change as younger people. But that's the beauty of time is that, as we go forward in time, you're going to become more and more esteemed and being able to look down on other people and tell them what to do as well. So hopefully that changes as we move forward. But I'm just wondering, like from a practical perspective, like obviously it makes sense, teaching classes about this kind of stuff. But what does it look like for a calculus teacher? Somebody who's teaching a course on calculus. How do they change that course to include some of this kind of stuff? Just like practically speaking, as an example.
Yeah. So this is something that definitely comes up where like you're talking about things like physics and calculus, and it's just like very like we're just going to talk about numbers right now, or we're just going to follow how numbers work.
Right.
But like racism has been a part of calculus. Like we know that like there are very few Black mathematicians, and you can spend like a class unpacking that and really like thinking about why that is, right? If you happen to have like that one Black student in your class and you pause like the hardcore like mathematical like practices for a minute to say like, hey, we want you here. That's going to be a really big experience for that student, one. And two, it's going to introduce all their classmates to these problems that they have no idea that this one student is facing. Right. And so you don't necessarily have to be like, the math of racism is, although you could, and that actually would probably be a really fun class where you'd like statistically analyze like how racism works.
Yeah, that actually sounds like I would take that class, to be honest. Like that does sound really fascinating. But
I think it's worth like taking the time to just like stop the actual like precise thing that you're studying and say, let's look at the bigger context of the field, right? Because I've been in like bio classes where we take a pause and we talk about like being a researcher or like working in biology as a field. Like if you're considering a career in biology, then here's what you need to know. Right. So if like in a calculus class, if they're going to pause and say, if you're considering a career in math, this is what you need to know, then you should also be able to pause and say, the field of math has this problem.
Right. And this is how we're trying to address it by telling the stories that have been historically forgotten or were purposefully forgotten. So like we know very few like Black mathematicians, like you said. So if we were to tell the story, okay, these were the people who were doing the work, but their work might have been overlooked until a white man came along and presented the exact same work. Or a woman was doing the work. Like if you look at someone like Ada Lovelace, her work was phenomenal, but it obviously wasn't being given the same the same credentials because she was a woman at the time. And so looking back, we can say, okay, we should have been giving her so much more credit than she got in her time. And by just acknowledging that this was something that was overlooked at the time, that we want to rectify it going forward, it at least sets everyone on the same page that we recognize this is a problem and we want to fix this problem. It starts with addressing that there is a problem so that everyone is on the same page, that we know this is a problem that we don't want to continue allowing to persist.
It's amazing because it sounds like you're in the middle of creating these, I don't want to say necessarily just guidelines, but information, right? You're putting out information. You're making yourself available to people who want to change, who have recognized, hey, this is a problem because, they're hearing nationally Black Lives Matter was a big movement this year that got a lot of people thinking about, whoa, how do we think about the systemic racism in our own institutions and in our own local sphere of influence? And that's great. Some people are motivated to do that. Some people are not.
Right.
Some people don't want to think about this stuff. It's distracting. It's taking away from the work that they want to do. They're only interested in their cutting edge physics research that they do, and they only want to deal with the students who come to them who want to talk about that. And anything else that comes to culture issues and race is just terrifying for them to even think about.
Yeah.
Right.
What do we do with people like that?
Yeah, so I think academia definitely favors people who have that tunnel vision approach to life. But I think you have to, as an institution, right? So I think of this as on the level of an institution, you decide what the foundational principles of your institution are, right? So at UChicago, one of our foundational principles is free expression, right? We're very, very into free speech,
right?
And that is the purpose of that is to facilitate free academic discourse, so people can talk about crazy ideas and then come up with crazy discoveries and really push the boundaries. They want to foster innovation by fostering free discourse. If you add anti-racism to your foundational principles of your institution, tunnel vision isn't part of your institution. Everybody has to be on board with the fact that we are going to be anti-racist as a university. And that means that your field has to actively be invested in being anti-racist, which means you have to spend at least 15 minutes of your life thinking about racism. I'm sorry, it's part of the job description.
And
right?
what can universities do to enable their professors who aren't necessarily as motivated to take this on of their own free will and accord? What can universities do to help people like that along and help get some of this teaching into their minds and hopefully even into their classrooms?
Yeah, so I think this one's actually pretty simple. The universities direct the culture of their campus by incentivizing certain kinds of research, right? They incentivize certain kinds of programs. They incentivize certain kind of research by saying, we're going to make a grant. If you do this, we'll give you the money to do this. Or we're going to make an award. If you do this, we'll give you the award and you'll be recognized. That is the currency of academia, is awards and grants. So if a university funds people who do this sort of work or rewards people who do this sort of work, then all of a sudden there's this incentive to do this sort of stuff, and the culture will shift towards what is being prioritized by the university as a whole.
Wow. Do you see this happening yet? Is this something that you've been pushing in your university or in other universities? Yeah,
so this actually is happening. It's not I don't think it's very visible yet because it's still happening at the administrative presidential levels, right? So it's walled up in the very highest hallowed halls of academia. But eventually, I think it's going to become more noticeable where we have provosts of diversity and inclusion, which have grants for diversity and inclusion projects or awards for recognition of good anti-racist teaching, that sort of stuff. I know that at least that's in the works at UChicago. I've been talking to the provost of diversity and inclusion at UChicago pretty often about this sort of stuff. So I know it's happening there. And I've also heard stories from people who are in higher ed at other universities where this sort of process is also happening. The concept of paying the diverse students for the D&I work that they do is pretty mainstream now. It took maybe 3 years, but it's on the table. It comes up at every meeting.
Perfect.
And
because you guys are doing actual work
with awards and stuff.
you're doing work that like
is improving the university.
Right. If you were living in an apartment, right? If going to a university is living in an apartment, you're basically adding a new fridge to the apartment. You're changing out all the appliances to be stainless steel. You're changing the counters to be granite. Like you're improving the space for the next tenant, even if you move out. So it benefits the landlord to let you continue improving things.
Well, even pay for it. Yeah.
Right.
No, that's phenomenal. Are there organizations outside of the university, specific universities, that maybe review universities on this kind of thing and like put out, say this we're really proud what this university is doing, or for students who say that they want to go to a school that's really doing a good job with this, where would a prospective college student look to identify which colleges or universities are leading the field in this?
All right, this is less of a feel-good answer. I don't think there is a big like universal organization that like reviews universities as to like how inclusive they are.
Mm-hmm.
I wish there was.
Okay.
But I don't think that exists yet. We do have smaller like societies for particular researchers. So for example, the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos, Native Americans in Science, SACNAS, you could use the SACNAS network to kind of connect with other people at universities, and then you yourself manually figure out what university is going to be like most inclusive and best for you.
Mm-hmm.
And there's other organizations like SACNAS, like SHEP is for engineers of color. There's a neuroscience version.
Mm-hmm.
So you could do it that way using like the network of Black and Hispanic researchers at universities across the country.
Okay.
But I don't think there's like a USA reviews of like anti-racism at universities. Though we do talk about making something like that pretty often in these like student leadership groups.
Yeah.
Where like, if only there was a way we could like just give the university a grade each year as to how well they're doing.
Because then you'd incentivize the university. You're talking about using the university to incentivize the professors.
Hold them
but then once you
accountable.
incentivize the university,
Yes, that's fantastic. So it sounds like there's a good opportunity for that. So any students out there who have a little bit of extra time on their hands.
If you feel like doing extra work again.
Right. Like if you feel like doing a whole lot of unpaid work to build this, here is the direction you go.
Or even better, if somebody out there is working on that, we'd love to talk to them. So hopefully we can do our research on that and find out, other people who are working on this problem and other ways that they're finding solutions to it. Because I think it makes sense that you need something even above the university that provides some accountability or incentive, even better. I love the way you talk about incentives, because it's less of when you think about the carrot and the stick approach, right? The more you can make good carrots and get everybody excited about the carrots, I feel like the less you need the stick. And the less pushback you get. The more you use the stick, the more you end up with this people not like people don't like the stick. So you end up with a negative response to it. And I love hearing that there's ways to to provide incentives to make changes here that gets more people on board. I think that's so fantastic. So awesome.
Yeah, there are also like disincentives too. The NIH has actually really led the charge on like creating this disincentive structure, which is why like GRIT even was able to exist, because the NIH was like, all right, if you don't have enough students of color on your training grant, we're taking away your training grant.
Wow,
and,
that's amazing.
The departments were like,
oh shit,
we've never tried to get students of color before. What do we do, right? And so then they realized they had these students who were willing to do this like stuff for them and teach them how to do it. And they're like, okay, this is a distinct monetary benefit for us because we can't lose this training grant. We need this money. And to keep this training grant, we need diverse students. So here we're going to help us get these diverse students.
Do you know when that started?
GRIT started around 2016. So I think the training grant like diversity requirement must have happened somewhere around 2015, 2016, but I could be wrong.
Okay. And do you know who's...
yeah, it was a relatively recent thing.
Do you know who's enabling that to happen? Like who would be responsible for making a change like that at the NIH level? Is it Congress that it pushes for that kind of stuff? Or is it just, it happened to be that there were people at the NIH who recognized that this was a problem and they were like, we're going to do something about it?
Yeah. So it was definitely the people who like write and review the grants, and like the people who like to say, we're going to make this many training grants, we're going to give them to this many schools, they will have this much money. The people who build the grants would be the people who put in these these requirements. I don't know what particular office or like position within the NIH does that, but it would be somewhere towards the top of like grant administration.
That's an interview we need to get. We need to figure out who was responsible for making that kind of change and talk to them and find out, what led to that and find out how we can do more kind of stuff like that. Cause that's so exciting to hear that, because at the end of the day, funding is everything, right? Mm-hmm. And whoever holds the money is able to influence, not just what research gets done, but how the research is being done and recognizing that it's so important that we have diversity at the student level, at the research level, at the professor level. It gives us better science. Mm-hmm. It gives us better access to information that can change our world in better ways. So it is better for all of us. If we're interested in truth seeking, at getting to the bottom of things, at understanding our world better, the more eyeballs and perspectives we can have involved in uncovering that truth, the closer we get to the truth. So it's amazing to hear that at the NIH that kind of push is already happening. But the question is, how can we get more of that happening? So we're going to have to find that person and get that interview for sure.
My favorite part about like that topic is like, if you have more diverse people, you're going to just have better research. Mm-hmm. That's already been proven. Yeah. Right. There have been studies where they make teams that are like racially monolithic, gender, like monogendered, and then teams that are like diverse with like lots of people of different races, people of different ethnicities, people of different like genders. Mm-hmm. And the diverse teams just do better at problem solving as a whole. Like this is just a thing we know.
I am going to absolutely need to see that study. That is phenomenal. That's amazing. Cause it makes sense, but like science isn't just about saying things make sense. It's
nice
about proving
actually have the data.
Yeah. It's always great when you can look at the data and go, well, this indisputable fact that we have tested over and over, that has been peer reviewed, that we know for a fact works. Let's, maybe invest in that since it clearly works.
That's going to be another good interview. I want to interview the people who did that study. That's awesome.
That's so cool. So where do you see this kind of training going? Do you see it being built as like a bigger curriculum overall as a whole? Do you see it becoming like a standardized curriculum or just like a standard that universities across the country and potentially across the globe kind of adhere to? Or do you think that this is like, where do you see this having a cap?
I'm not sure what direction this will take ultimately, like on the national scale. So one example of like how this happens is while I was in grad school, somewhere around like 2017 or so, big Ivy League universities stopped requiring the GRE. There were like a bunch of studies that were showing that the GRE was like just inherently racist. It was biased towards like affluent white students, and just if you were Black, you were just statistically less likely to do well in the GRE, even though that didn't reflect your ability to do well in graduate programs. So universities were like, you know what, the GRE tells us nothing besides giving us a reason to exclude Black students. So we're not going to require it anymore. You can apply to grad school. You don't need to take a GRE. We're just going to look at like your research experience and your recommendation letters. That happened at like the big Ivy League schools first. And that kind of like set off a wave because all these schools compete with each other for the same pool of students.
Right.
And so like, if one school doesn't require the GRE, a bunch of diverse students will apply there and not here. So we have to get rid of our GRE requirement. That's usually how these kinds of like changes happen.
Yep.
So if a school like institutes this big diversity training program, and it's very successful, and they get a bunch of more diverse students, everyone else is just going to fall in line and follow that example because they're like, well, it worked for them, and we don't want to be left behind and be like that one racist school that didn't do that.
Right.
So it's kind of like keeping up with the Joneses is what's going to force these changes to happen. And it just depends like what each individual institution manages to come up with and what's going to work, and then who's going to be the leader for the next like diversity innovation.
That's amazing.
So it's hard to guess which one is actually going to like happen and stick.
So, I mean,
but it's possible that someone would make like a program like that.
But that's great to hear that at the very least, it sounds like there is incentive for these universities to be coming up with new ideas for making their schools more diverse, and therefore they can, compete with each other in that capacity to, enable more new ideas to come through. How do you see yourself do you see yourself staying involved in this work when you're done with, kind of your student portion of your career as you move on to, being a postdoc and whatever you do after that? Is this something that you can see yourself still staying involved with? Or are you kind of excited for the day where you don't have to worry about it anymore? You can just focus on your research. How do you feel about it?
I'm pretty sure that my career is going to lean more towards the diversity and inclusion stuff than the science stuff.
Okay.
I've actually recently been getting into science policy, which is like how you're talking about the people at the NIH who decide who gets what.
Right.
That's science policy.
Nice.
So I've been moving more into that, because what I would like to do is, like, since I've been like working from the bottom up at UChicago, trying to like do D&I work, it'd be nice to work from the top down.
Yeah.
So I would like to, I would like to try
language
and apply
here.
all these. I would like to try to apply all these things that I've learned about working with faculty, training students, like being anti-racist, to like a larger scale. That's actually been my goal from the jump. Initially, I planned to like become a faculty so I could be a dean, so that I could like have all this authority over like the culture of a university.
Right.
And I realized the better way to do that is just go to the people who write the grants.
Nice.
So yeah, I'm going to probably be doing this diversity and inclusion work for the foreseeable future in some form. It might not be like obvious that like the science policy work that I'm doing, it like affects issues around racism and gender, but racism and gender intersect with everything.
Literally. Yeah.
So regardless of what I'm doing, I'm going to be doing this work in some capacity.
That is amazing. Well, we are so excited to follow along. And we hope that as you come up with new ideas for, solving these problems or take on new roles and new positions, you will come back and talk to us about them, because this topic is so important, so near and dear to our heart, because we talk about these issues, kind of at a larger societal level, or the way they impact our lives from our own lived experience. But it is so important to tell these stories about how they impact different people's lives in so many different ways. So we really look forward to watching your career unfold and watch the work that you continue to do. And please come back and tell us about it as things materialize.
So my question is, obviously you've been doing a ton of work in diversity and inclusion. If you, like when you're starting your approach and talking to professors and talking to different people about this, do you have any like go-to resources that you're just like, okay, if you're going to start this work, we really want you to like read this article, read this book, watch this video. Here are like a list of resources that like we like are the baseline, like get through here, and now we can like go from there. Give
us your pitch to the new professor who wants to learn more.
Yeah. So in terms of a list of resources, when this past summer happened and there was like that big wave of civil unrest,
right.
Students at my university and at universities across the country all got together and started making these big Google Docs of like resources for people who want to learn what anti-racism is right now.
Yes.
And so like, it's not that I have like a couple set of like, read this paper, like read this book, watch this YouTube video. It's that like all of us do.
Yes.
So
trust me when I say I have that Google Doc. Like I have a completely separate Google Doc on my phone that I've created where it's just like, I've come across far too many like articles on racism, books on racism. I get asked this question far too often that it's like, all right, I'm just going to keep this list for the next person that asks me, because they will.
Yeah. So I think in academia, people act like we don't know how to address this. There's no information about this. There's tons of information about this. There's tons of studies about this. We've like, put them all into nice, convenient Google Docs with like introductions and like indexes if you would like to get into this sort of information. So yeah, this stuff definitely does exist. I have a version, but mine is not like the definitive version.
Right.
So I want to just put it out there. Like if you look for it, you will find it. Like like professors who do want to start like engaging with topics of like discrimination and institutionalized racism, I highly, highly encourage they do so. Usually what professors do is they like find that one person of color that they know of in the department. They're like, tell me what racism is.
Yes.
It's much better to just give it a Google. Give it a Google. See if you can find some forums. See if you can like hop onto some like ResearchGate articles or like wherever your scientific society is. There are people who already have this stuff waiting and ready for you.
Yeah.
It sounds like we need a website, that we can just send people to that has this information. It's like a starting point, because obviously it's great if you can identify somebody in your local community that has this ready for you. But we also don't want to necessarily put that onus on every, person of color in an institution to be like, I have to, be ready for this because I'm going to have to be the one who teaches everybody around me what this, how this stuff works. It would be nice if we could just kind of point people to a website and be like, this is your starter point. Yes, still try to find people in your local community that can help you with it. And so you can get their, perspective, but at least here's a starting point that they can get you off the ground. That would be really valuable.
Yeah. And I think that's basically, that's basically the function of like the diversity provost, right? Like they are now that central like point of all right, you don't know what you're doing, go to their website, right? Like there's.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. Usually when people ask me that question, I recommend How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. That's usually like my baseline go-to, and White Fragility by Dr. Robin DiAngelo. And I think it's interesting because like those are really great places to start. And one of my friends actually recommended a workbook called White Supremacy and Me that apparently is like,
ooh.
Yeah. And this is actually one of my white women friends. She is in an anti-racist accountability group, and her anti-racist accountability group, basically, they are going through this workbook, this White Fragility and Me workbook. And as they go through each chapter, it's breaking down all the different ways that white supremacy has directly affected them in their everyday life without them actually realizing it, or how they have contributed to it in some capacity in their everyday life without realizing it. And I think that's always like, I think it's really interesting to have like a book where it's not just like, oh, I'm reading through like someone else's writings, where you're actually like answering questions and like giving like your multiple choice and seeing like how your life has actually directly been impacted by white supremacy and how you've been benefiting from it and how you may have been reinforcing or contributing to it inadvertently throughout your life. So I'm always really interested in getting those resources to people.
I love the idea of a workbook. Like let's work through your internalized racism. Let's just unpack it together.
Yeah, no, that sounds really powerful, actually. And I love thinking about ways that, we can have like concrete things that people can do. It's not just because it can be a little much, and you say, well, just go read these books, and how many books do people read a year, and so it's like people might buy the book and they might leaf through it, but are they spending enough time with it? It's like when you give people really concrete things that they can do that are maybe not quite as much of an undertaking, I think that we can get more stuff happening.
Right. And I think that's one of the things that like me personally is my goal with the podcast, is to try to have easily digestible information that like someone can listen to in an hour and come out of it with more of a nuanced understanding of a different perspective of the world. And hope that like, even if they don't fully understand what it's like to live life as a woman of color, they can understand our perspective a little bit better and see from the other side a little bit clearer, and be able to have more empathy because of it.
Yeah. How important is empathy in this journey for you?
Yeah. So when I first started doing this stuff, I thought like the way that we were going to get the ball rolling on getting like faculty on board with like being more inclusive and more willing to work with diverse students was to build empathy in them. I thought if I am able to show faculty these stories of the experiences of people of color in research, and they could see like, wow, this problem happens over and over again to all sorts of different students. And if this was happening to me, I would be upset. I should do something about this because this just isn't fair. Building that empathy in faculty was my goal initially. And it's still a really important part of doing this work. But now I'm kind of focusing on like just making institutional policies that kind of like make people have to do that on their own. Like you have to now go out and look for the experiences of students of color. You have to go out and try and understand this problem because now it's your problem.
That's amazing.
I love that. So basically you're taking Kendi's approach where you're eliminating racist laws and racist rules and changing them to be more inclusive, and that creates an inclusive environment, which creates inclusive people. So it eliminates the personal responsibility or the moral weight of it.
Right. Because a lot of people think racism is like one white person just out there being racist, like just running around saying the N-word.
Right.
And it's not. It's like how the institution has been built to systematically exclude people of color without anyone noticing that that's happening.
Right.
Right. So I think if we're going to like deconstruct structural racism, we need structural solutions. So while building empathy in professors is super important for creating like a good training environment and a good like working environment, a good culture in a department, getting an entire academic institution to be anti-racist involves making new rules, taking out old rules, and like changing the structure of the institution.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, the most beautiful thing about all of this is that as we make these structural changes and we make these institutions more accessible for people of color and make them more welcoming and a better place for them, you end up with more people of color, hopefully, in these institutions being able to continue to influence and continue to be able to give somebody an avenue for hearing a different person's life experience. Because if you just simply don't come across people that are different from you, you just don't have that opportunity. A friend of mine constantly reminds me of this. He grew up in Nebraska, and here living in New York City, we have the opportunity to get to know people who have different life experiences than us, and it enables us to be more empathetic towards their life experience. When you take what you've learned here in New York back to Nebraska, it can be very difficult to translate your understanding to somebody who simply doesn't have the right life experience and hasn't talked to or doesn't have shared life experience with people of different perspectives. And it's almost like they're on a different planet.
Yeah.
It makes it so difficult to have these conversations with people who don't have that life experience. So the beautiful thing that I see happening here, at least in these academic institutions, is that as you make the institutions better, you enable more people with different life experiences to come into them and to continue that snowball effect happening. You can't necessarily make it happen in rural Nebraska because you're not just going to like move out, have a bunch of people move out there and be like, we're here to like, show you our different life experience.
Just inject Black people into rural Nebraska.
Right. That geographic divide is going to continue to be a problem for changing perspectives nationally. But at least in the academic institutions, I see progress being made in a good way that's going to enable more progress to happen, which is a wonderful thing to witness.
I also think that if we can affect change in academia, we could also affect systemic change on a wider scale in other areas as well, because academia is so staunch and rigid and set in its ways that if we can affect major sweeping changes in academia to the point where it's structurally different from how it was, say, 50 years ago, I think that is something that we could take to other aspects of life, like the finance world or like the entertainment industry, the service industry, and say, okay, so we were able to fix academia on this kind of a wide scale. We can apply those principles of how we were able to do this to this new facet and do this top down, like it worked here. Why can't that work for us?
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah, and I think it also goes the other way too. Like a lot of the programs that I'm in try and use diversity programming from companies and from industry, because like maybe some companies in industry are farther ahead than we are. So it's kind of like an exchange of like ideas and like technologies and methodologies.
That's amazing. Yeah.
I love it.
Well, we know how busy you are.
This has been a fantastic conversation. I obviously love talking about stuff like this. This is amazing.
We can't thank you enough for taking the time to come and talk to us about this. And where can people find you online if they want to get to know more about your work specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I can direct them to my LinkedIn and my Twitter, though I don't use Twitter very much at the moment. I'm going to have to soon. But let me pull this up. My Twitter is crfabengineer.
crfabengineer. Love it. Is LinkedIn a big thing for people still in school, or is that something that you only kind of start to think about towards the end?
I think people in school use LinkedIn pretty often.
Really?
Science Twitter has become a whole thing.
Yeah.
That needs to be engaged in by this individual.
Yeah, we love Science Twitter. We learn so much from Science Twitter. We get access to the actual people doing the science. It's amazing that platform exists.
John has a lot of fun in Science Twitter.
I do.
I will email you the links to my Twitter and my LinkedIn later.
Perfect. We will put all of those in the show links just in case anyone wants to learn more about what you're doing, where you're going, and check on you later.
And of course, all those resources that we've been mentioning throughout the podcast.
Of course.
Everything will be in the show notes so that people can use this as a jumping off point to learning more about how to approach these topics themselves.
Heck yeah.
Awesome.
This was really fun. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Christina. And good luck with the rest of your work. And fingers crossed for the election tonight. Hopefully by the time this is published, we'll know the results. Awesome. Thanks again, Christina.
Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye.
Yeah, you too.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for checking out this clip from our show.
To watch more clips or full episodes, click on our profile below.
If you want to stay up to date on all of our new episodes and videos, click subscribe.
And if you have any ideas for future guests or topics that you would like to see us cover on the show,
leave us a message in the comments or connect with us on any of our social media channels at Funtime Program.
Or on our website at funtimeprogram.com.
We'll see you in the next one.
Bye-bye.